Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 46 of 46 podcast. I hope your year is off to a fast start. Winter is in full swing up here in the ADK. It's white, it's snowy. It's a good time of year to be out in the backcountry, but make sure you are extra prepared this time of year because those mountains, they do not care about you. You do not need to test them. Make sure that you have done your homework, you have the gear, you know where you're going, and go with someone also. Not the time of year to be out there solo. If you ask me, you can always find someone to come with you. And if you can't, really be very cautious about where you do go. Highly recommend you finding a guide or going with someone no matter what, because again, things happen in the backcountry and in the winter, they happen a lot faster. But today I have one of our favorite guests back on the podcast for the millionth time. Erik Schlimmer is back. He's got some new books. He's had some adventures, so we're going to catch up and kick off this year right. Erik Schlimmer, welcome back to the 4646 podcast.
Thank you, James. It's always good to talk to you. And of course, I was listening to you, but I was also taking a walk down memory lane when you're talking about how bad the weather can be in the Adirondacks. And I just was telling somebody the other day, the worst hiking I've ever done in my life anywhere on the planet is in the Adirondacks last week of December. December is a mean month.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, tell us why. We got to hear the story now at this point.
Well, one of my hiking goals I was working on for a few years and I finished before I moved out here to Colorado is I wanted to climb the 217 peaks in the range above 3,000 feet during winter. And at the time, this was 2019 when I finished, I was only the second person. I think maybe one other person have done it. Well, winter begins usually around December 21st. So what I would try to do is get into the more remote peaks before the snow piled up and before some critical dirt roads were snowed in for the winter. So I wouldn't have to ski all the way in. I could actually drive in my four-wheel drive car. And it always happened that the last week of December, it's not cold enough for snow. It's not warm enough for rain. And so it's just a lot of freezing rain, mixed bag. I'm out there by myself in the middle of nowhere. And that was the period of winter where I had the least successes trying to get up peaks. You know, once you get a lot of snow and it's compacted, the travel's pretty easy. But the last week of December, very little can say of it that's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough time of year to be out there. Tough time of year. Now, let me ask you a question. I've actually wondered this myself. So you are kind of like, you're like the king of Adirondack bushwhacking. I'm sure you would probably say, no, I'm not. And I would say, sure. But you have obviously climbed unbelievable amounts of mountains. What is your workflow when you're preparing here to go climb all these 3,000 footers that have no trails to them? You know, the 2,500 foot, like these mountains that you see when you're on a mountain, you see all these other smaller mountains out there that like there's nothing to get there. What is your workflow? Obviously map and compass, but like kind of take us through that. I'd love to know.
Right. Well, no, I am not the most experienced bushwhacker. I'm near the top of the list in the Adirondacks, but some people have done some really amazing, impressive things up there. My theme has always been that I like to do what other people aren't doing, hence the 3,000 footers in winter. And then I went on to climb the 601 peaks above 2,500 feet. And I was the first finisher, and I don't think that's been repeated yet, but what a fine list. So a lot of these lists, if you start at the very beginning, I would have to compose my own list. Now, the 3,000 footer list was already around. I was familiar with that. But I had to look at basically every square inch of the Adirondacks to try to find every peak above 2,500 feet. The general rule in the Northeast is if it rises 200 feet on all sides, you can count it as a real mountain. Doesn't matter if it has a name or not. It's just by chance. And so I totaled up 601. Now, I've never been a day hiker. So the best way to go about trying to get these lists finished that are hundreds and hundreds of peaks deep are backpacking trips. So my typical trip in the Adirondacks would be 3 days, whether it's winter, summer, fall, whatever. I do the same thing here in Colorado. By the time I get to the trailhead, by the time I get up the first peak, it's time to turn around. But if I'm going out for a couple nights, I could do a nice loop hike and maybe grab 6, maybe 7 peaks if I'm lucky. So I like to give myself a lot of extra time so that I have a high success rate reaching these peaks. And yeah, I'm a map and compass guy. All my hiking in the Northeast dates all the way back to 1985. I'm really dating myself here. I've never used a GPS, never used a phone. It was always straight up map and compass, which is really rewarding because orienteering is a thinking man's and a thinking woman's sport. Okay, there's some detective work. You have to read the terrain. You have to pay attention. You don't have this machine doing all the work for you. So you have to be very conscious of where you are, where you're going, and how you're going to get back out. I find it immensely rewarding. Now I use a phone here in Colorado. I just turn on my phone. Oh, there's my mapping app. I find absolutely no reward in it, though it is convenient.
Yeah. So what is your work? So, you go out there for days at a time. You're going to bag a few different peaks throughout the days. You're going to camp. So do you have this planned? You have each mountain planned before you head out there and, almost where you're going from each spot? Or are you figuring it out on top of each summit, which direction you're going? And then are you getting the map and compass out and, taking a bearing and everything? Like, is that the workflow for you? Or what does that look like?
Right. I don't do a lot of planning because for me, it's just kind of business as usual. I just hike all the time. So it got to the point, at least in the Adirondacks, where I could glance at a map. And in a couple of seconds, I could see how many peaks I could climb, right? If it's a 1 to 62,000 scale map, I know 1 inch is 1 mile. I'll just kind of glance at it and I'm like, I could probably do those 6 in maybe 2 days, or I could do these 2 in 3 days, whatever it is. Find the most practical trailhead. So I'd have to see, is there a river to ford? Are there swamps to get around? Are there cliffs I can't navigate? Because the closest trailhead to my destination was not always the best one. It was the terrain between me and that first peak and the second peak and the third peak. So I climb whatever the closest peak is. I get on top. I have a look around. And at that time, I'm going to just take a straight field bearing or map bearing to the next peak. So I never pre-plot anything before I go out. I glance at the map. Okay, yeah, I could probably do these 5 in 2 days and then head in with my map and compass. What really helps for me, I travel really light. If anybody saw my overnight pack, it looks like a day pack. So I just bring a tarp, lightweight sleeping bag, contractor's garbage bag for the ground, some clothing, some food, and that's about it. I usually wear a day pack even on my overnight trips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm the exact opposite. I'm the guy that has the 30-pound pack in the summertime because he's just, a nervous Nelly, I guess, when I head out there. But I do love seeing the video, seeing your camping setups. They're so, they're nothing. You just explained it. It's an amazing thing. Were you always that way? Was that always the situation, or did you just over the years whittle it down more and more?
Oh, yeah. I whittled it, and not with a pocket knife, with like a chainsaw. That's the kind of whittling I was doing. Because at the beginning, I started backpacking. 1995 was my first long distance hike. And if you don't know what to bring, just bring everything. I had a 5,500 cubic inch pack. And it's funny, I actually have a photo of me on the Northville Placid Trail from 1995. For the love of God, I have no idea what could possibly be in that backpack. I don't even know if I own enough stuff to actually fill it to the brim now. So it was a lot of trial and error. I spent some cold nights, I wish I brought this piece of gear. But now it's totally dialed in for different parts of the U.S. as well. So if I'm going to the desert, I know what to bring and not bring. I go to the Northeast, I know what to bring and not bring. It's very specific to usually where I'm going.
Yep. Makes so much sense. I so often will ask people like, what's your backpack weigh? And they're like, oh, it's, 12 pounds, 15 pounds. I'm like, my backpack's 30 pounds and I don't know what I have in it. That is, I mean, I bring 6 liters of water half the time in the high peaks because again, nervous, even though there's always rivers and stuff to just stop and fill up. But, I just don't, I guess, for whatever reason. But yeah, I need to take that chainsaw approach. I really do. That seems like the right approach for me at this point, because I can't whittle it down. I need to just, all right, we got to cut it in half or just like start over. And yeah, anyways, very good. So what adventures have you been on lately? So obviously you're in Colorado now, but you're still putting out books all about the Adirondacks. But what are some recent adventures you found yourself on?
I think 3 different adventures are worth mentioning. I'm working on a goal here in Colorado to climb 1,000 different peaks. I'm at 854, though I'm not counting. And I think I'll be done in 2 years. The original goal was to climb 1,000 peaks above 10,000. And we have gobs of peaks that high. But then I started climbing the little peaks, and the same thing happened out here that happened in the Northeast. I love little hills. There's just something about them. They got great little personalities. So I'm working on that, trying to get up to 1,000. I've been plugging away at the 800-mile Arizona Trail. I've done 3 section hikes, and I'm about a third done with it. I like to go out for between 100 and 150 miles. It's my wintertime destination. And the most recent long distance hike I did was about a year ago, and that was in Texas. And it was one of the toughest hikes I've ever done. It was very mentally challenging, and it was quite different than what I usually do. It's an abandoned rail line. It's a rail trail called the Caprock Trailway. It's up on the Great Plains. It's actually really pretty, up by Lubbock, Texas. And it rained almost the entire time. I did a double traverse, so it was about 130, 135 miles. And most of the trip was 37 degrees and rain. I did not see a single person for 130 miles.
Impressive.
And totally froze my butt off. And the rain was so bad at one point, I slept in a culvert under a road. It was
There you go.
one of the worst trips I've ever done, but such trips build resiliency and build character, and then you have a good story to bring home.
Ain't that the truth? And in the moment, you remind yourself this will be funny later, but in the moment, it's not funny right now. It's actually awful.
Yes, it's like wine. This isn't any good now, but as it ages, we'll look back on this and have a good laugh.
Yeah, and we'll say it was great. We'll say it was a great time. It was awesome, great wine, etc. Very good. All right, cool. What's on tap for you for 2025? You must have some things on your radar besides for the 1,000 peak goals and everything.
Right, we've got that pesky 1,000 peaks. Tomorrow morning, I leave for southern New Mexico. I've spent a lot of time now in Arizona, and its neighbor is just as beautiful. For a guy who grew up in the woods of the Adirondacks, I'm very attracted to deserts. There's something very special about them. They have a certain feeling about them. So I'll be in New Mexico for the next week, climbing some small peaks. I'll definitely do a long distance hike in 2025. Again, I like these shorter distances now, between 100 and 300 miles. But I'm always kind of the last to know what I'm doing. I kind of plan things very last minute. So a couple irons in the fire, a long distance hike somewhere, and we'll call that good enough.
Mm-hmm. Any bike trips for 2025?
Thank you. Yes, I forgot. I'm now a mountain biker. So I got back into mountain biking recently after a decade-long absence. And I will do a few trips, probably 200, 300 miles. You can ride, 60 miles a day. And Colorado has thousands upon thousands of miles of dirt roads. So it's very easy to piece together a 200, 300 mile bike packing loop for a mountain biker. It's an ideal state for that sport.
Yeah, 100%. Very good. One of the things I admire about you most is you create your adventure. You don't like look to see like what are things that people do. You you decide what are things that people do, and I admire that tremendously. And I think anyone listening to this podcast, most of you don't live in the ADK, but you sure always want to be here. But you can create your own adventures wherever you live by just getting a little creative, piecing things together, doing something that's different and out of the ordinary, and just creating those memories yourself. So I always admire that about you, Erik. Great stuff.
Yeah, and this has been going on for me for quite a while, but I was probably influenced by others. There are some real unsung heroes in the history of Northeast backpacking and long distance hiking who have done some amazing non-traditional things. A couple of people influenced me to do this, and it does usually be rewarding to travel the path less traveled.
Well said. Well said. I feel like there's a book in there, a book in there in that sentence right there for you, especially given everything that you've written. There's a book in that sentiment that is would be well received. But let's talk about some new books. So you got some new books out here. So we've got Wicked Awesome Adirondack Chronology, 1524 to 2024, and then your Cranberry Lake Toponyms book. So let's talk a little bit about those books. Tell us a little bit about both, and then we'll dive in a little deeper, because I got to know more.
Well, yeah, one's quite small and one's quite big.
Yeah,
so maybe we should start with the baby of the two, the little brother, Cranberry Lake, 50 place names. My main research endeavor is why things in the mountains are named so. Mountains, lakes, rivers, streams, whatever. I had written a guidebook on this topic to the Northville Placid Trail and the Trans-Adirondack route. I said, well, we have another long trail, 50 miles long, but that's okay. The Cranberry Lake, 50 in the Northwest Adirondacks. So it's a very quick book. The trail only has 35 named features that it encounters. And so that's just a brief guide, small enough to put in your pocket that you can bring it with you. And as you hike the trail and you cross, let's say, Brandy Brook, I'll just take out this book because I can't even guess. And I like to say behind every name, there's a story, and the story is usually pretty good.
All right. I love it. And the last time you were on the podcast, you had either just written the book or you were currently writing, and then you were coming to the ADK to hike the trail. Tell us about that. Tell us about that endeavor.
Right. So if I'm going to write about something, I like to experience it. And I said, well, I'll be back in the Northeast for some presentations at some venues and sell some books. And I'll do a double loop of the Cranberry 50, starting downtown Wanakina and go clockwise, and then I'll go counterclockwise. This is now the third time I have come back to my home state of New York and got rained out. I've tried to plan trips in the past when I'm back east, and I get rained out every time. And I think it comes from being spoiled. I mean, I live in Colorado Springs. There is an 82% chance it will be sunny from sunup to sundown. As I look at my window now, there's not a single cloud in the sky, and it's already 55 degrees. So, it's this perpetual question I have I gotten soft, or am I just more intelligent?
Yeah, have you gotten smarter, maybe?
It might be a combination of the two.
Yeah, I get it. No, the last time you were on, we were talking about this book. So, and I did an episode with someone pretty closely after our episode together who did the ultra, and it's from the sounds of, and I've never hiked this trail. I've never heard anything good about it. So that's why it's like never really been on my radar. And then this episode with this young lady who did it as the ultra. It sounds like your book would actually make the hike itself a more interesting experience based on the feedback I hear from people about it being, quote, pretty boring and monotonous. So now you add your book to the mix, and all of a sudden you're taking a history lesson as you hike around the woods out there.
Yes, it may help your average Cranberry Lake 50 hiker as they're hiding in a lean-to as it pours for 3 days. They will have something to read.
Yeah, and swat the bugs away. Because that's Bug City out there, as is anywhere really in the ADK. But very good. All right, so let's talk about the next book, the big one of the two. Talk to us about that. So give us a little background on what it is, why you decided to write it, and tackle this gargantuan task of this book, and give us a little info about it.
So we have Wicked Awesome Adirondack Chronology. The term is a throwback to the 80s. I grew up in the town of Chester in Warren County. And back then, if you really liked something, it was Wicked Awesome. So this is kind of going retro with the title. Now, I had already written a series of history books about the Adirondacks. And as I was writing those individual titles, some really cool events stuck out. I remembered some groundbreaking hike, or somebody disappeared, or a plane crashed, or something like that. And I thought those events needed to have some second life brought into them and to be presented in an independent manner. Because my history books are pretty thorough, pretty dense. And so these dates and events just kind of blend into an overall story of the park. But here I have, I think it's 3,857, something like that, entries over the last 500 years. Almost all the entries take place in the Adirondacks. However, there are some entries that are just New York State in general, or the Northeast in general, to offer some context. Okay, so if I'm going to say, well, this is when the first sawmill was built in the Adirondack Park, it might be nice to know when the first one in the United States was built. And so I'll throw that in to give some context, but almost all the entries are exclusively within the blue line.
All right, very good. Very good. So let's talk about 1524. What's entry number 1? You must remember that one.
Sure. I knew you were going to ask that. So, of course, the history of the Adirondacks goes back well before 1524. And not to get too into it, I've been recently reading some discoveries in the United States that now show that humans have been in the Western Hemisphere way, way, way longer than we have thought. There was actually a site in South Carolina called the Topper Archaeological Site. Popular theory was people reached it about 11,000 years ago. They recently found a site that's at least 50,000 years old. So if you were going to write a true history, I don't even know where you would begin because we don't even know how far back it goes. But we do know that on April 17th, 1524, we had an explorer, and I'll read you the entry very briefly. So this is April 17, 1524. And of course, it being 2024, it just makes a nice round 500 years. While exploring the eastern seaboard in the ship La Dauphine in search of route to the Orient, Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing under a French flag, becomes the first European to examine the mouth of the Hudson River. And then it goes a little bit beyond that. But Verrazzano, of course, we have the Verrazzano Bridge named for him. He was the first person to enter the mouth of the Hudson River. Of course, the Hudson River begins in the Adirondacks. So I was like, well, let's just begin there.
Well, all right. Very good. Now, what made you want to tackle this project in particular? Because to even think about, all right, I gotta chronicle 500 years of history. This is a big task.
I thought it was necessary.
Okay.
And I think the types of books that I write age well. Okay, so when I was writing my other history books about New York State or the Adirondacks specifically, county histories, and some really, really good, robust history books written in the 1800s and early 1900s, I don't think those books were fully appreciated back then because it wasn't even history. It was modern accounts of the Adirondacks. Now we call them history books. So though I would like readers in 2024 and 2025 to read this, I like to flatter myself a little and think that this book could be important 50 or 100 years from now if we have another historian wanting to write about the range, because that was the gift given to me by authors from 100 and 200 years ago.
Got it. No, I love that. That's very logical, very logical explanation, and it makes perfect sense. Any specific stories that you want to share that come to mind off the top of your head during this 500-year chronicle that may be of fun interest to the listeners?
Right. Well, I picked out one per century for you.
Awesome. Let's
hear. I've picked out 5, and we'll of course start with the 1500s. And I tried to pick a very interesting one from each century. So we're in 1591, and the location is Northeast. Okay, so this is a general entry for the Northeast. French botanical artist, Florida explorer, and cartographer Jacques de Lemoyne de Morguet draws Lemoyne map and portrays the Northeast with a dozen mountainous humps and the label Chocola. This is the earliest map I've ever found that mountains were drawn on a map for the Northeast. That was in 1591. The Adirondacks wouldn't be labeled for about another 200 years. But it's the first map that somebody said, hey, I saw some mountains in the Northeast, and we should probably put them on a map.
Yep. I love it.
Okay.
Very nice. Makes so much sense. Got to have it.
Now we can fast forward to 1621, and this is just general New York entry. So as I like to say, before the Americans, there were the British. Before the British, there were the French. And before the French, there were the Dutch. Okay. So this entry says, via 5 occurrences, the Dutch hold a tight grip on New York State. All right. So these are the 5 things that the Dutch did to become the dominators of New York at the time. Henry Hudson is first to arrive in Albany in 1609. Dutchmen returned to the spot in 1610. A charter for trading is established in 1614. In 1620, the Dutch export 15,000 beaver pelts, and shortly after that, they built a fort and garrison in Albany. And that is what was worth more than gold back then, any kind of pelt.
Mm-hmm. 15,000. I mean, the Adirondacks, we are flush with beavers, and we're flush with them indeed.
We are. And the beaver, of course, is the New York State mammal. It is on the seal of Albany, and it's also on the seal of New York City. So the beaver played a significant part of history in the United States. Now we're up to 1771, just before the Revolutionary War, and this takes place in Essex, Hamilton, Herkimer, and Warren counties. In 1771, shipwrights Joseph Totten and Stephen Crossfield serve as land agents of Ebenezer and Edward Jessup and purchased rights to 1.1 million, Adirondack acres from the Mohawk and from King George III. So not a lot of people know this, but at one point, private individuals and their associates, as they would say back then, owned all of the Adirondacks. And that land was given to them, it was granted to them by whoever was the King of England at the time. Totten Crossfield Purchase is the second biggest landmass ever purchased in New York, 1.1 million acres. Now it's obviously dissolved because what happened is who owned it were a bunch of Tories. The Revolutionary War happened and New York State confiscated the land. If the Revolutionary War never happened, all of the Adirondacks would probably still be privately owned by British citizens. Pretty interesting.
Wow. That's actually fascinating. That is fascinating.
Okay, you are going to love this one.
I'm ready. Hit me.
This is 1870. I can never read this one with a straight face. It is so weird. 1871 in St. Lawrence County. Okay. The most bizarre death in Adirondack history occurs on the bigger of the 2 horseshoe ponds of the town of Piercefield. Okay. And this is what happens. W. Graves, proprietor of Graves Lodge, drives a swimming deer toward the shore. He catches up with it in a boat, grabs the deer by the tail, and bashes it over the head with an oar. Meanwhile, the deer capsizes the boat. Graves and his dog are tossed into the pond. The aspiring hunter grabs the dog by the tail. The dog hops onto Graves' shoulders, and he is drowned.
All right. What a terrible way to go. What a terrible way to go. Man. Bet he
Talk
wished
about
he
man's
waited.
best friend.
Oh my gosh. Bet he wished he waited for that deer to just like get to the other side of the pond there. Man, talk about things going wrong. Hey, remember we said it earlier in the episode. Things can go wrong in the backcountry. You never know. Maybe be careful about grabbing the tails of those deer when they're swimming out there. And then
Yes,
you can't really trust your dog sometimes. Clearly, this is what happened here. That's a fascinating story.
So bizarre. Now we're up into the 1900s. We have 1933. And in the late 20s and early 30s, there were what we would call today fastest known times. Bob Marshall traversed the Great Range in a day, and some other people heard of Marshall's accomplishment and actually did bigger hikes than him. This is an overlooked part of Adirondack history. There was a gentleman named H.L. Malcolm, and he was very active in 1933. He heard of Bob Marshall's record, and he said, well, I'm going to have to go up there and break it. So on the day of October 7, 1933, he starts hiking at 12:01 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And these are the peaks he climbed in 24 hours. Giant Mountain, Noonmark Mountain, Lower Wolfjaw, Upper Wolfjaw, Armstrong, Gothics, Saddleback, Basin, Little Haystack, Marcy, Skylight, Colden, Algonquin, and Mount Joe. He finishes at 11:06 p.m. It is 40 miles with 20,000 vertical feet.
It's a big old day. It's a big old day. Now, I had Katie Rhodes on, shout out to you, Katie, who did the Malcolm Traverse, but I feel like Noonmark was on that 3 times. Is that a different traverse that I'm referring to?
I remember that story. Yes. The gentleman wanted to just get a lot of vertical feet.
Yeah, that was the reason for up and down Noonmark at the end or whatever. I don't remember the exact mountains, but another absolutely bonkers day in the high peaks from that same gentleman.
Right. So just an amazing hike.
And remember, people, there are no trails. There's no the trails aren't like what we're dealing with today back then. So absolutely crazy, bonkers, really.
Right. So they did have to piece together. I don't think the Great Range Trail was quite done in 1933. I can't remember off the top of my head.
All right. So now, when you said that you have a fact for each century here, I'm actually quite curious. And as soon as you said that, I'm very curious to see what's the interesting fact for the current century we have here.
Right. And these vary quite a bit per century. The 1990s and the 2000s, it's a lot of missing people, plane crashes, trail construction, stuff like that. Obviously, back in the day, it was mostly exploration and empire building. It was tough to pick an entry for the 2000s, but there's a case I'm very interested in. I'm sure you're familiar with it. November 15, 2015 is the day 82-year-old Thomas Messick went missing. Okay, so this happened 3 miles from where I grew up. It was in Lake George Wild Forest. He's out there hunting with a couple guys. He doesn't return. And so the entry says he vanishes near Lily Pond while hunting with 6 friends and family members and is never found via a massive 2-month search involving more than 300 forest rangers, state troopers, county sheriffs, professional searchers, divers, and volunteers supported by search dogs and forward-looking infrared-equipped helicopters. This case is extremely odd.
Sure.
for a couple of reasons. And by the way, he has not been found. There is not a trace of Thomas Messick. He was 82 years old. He's a very experienced hunter. He was a hunting safety instructor, and he just happened to also be a former paratrooper. He was 82 at the time, and some of the party are out driving deer, and he was put in a stationary spot because of his age. So he's waiting for deer to be driven to him. He doesn't show up back at the campsite. And eventually this search is initiated. It's extremely odd because it's a quite small area. It's not like he was in the middle of West Canada Lake wilderness area. He's near Brant Lake. He's familiar with the area. He has a walkie-talkie and he has a rifle with him. Now, he could have just dropped dead. He did have some heart problems, but again, it's not a very big place. And I know it's difficult to see far in the Adirondacks, but this place was combed over 1,000 times and not a single trace. Now, I'm only mildly familiar with search techniques. I've taken the basic search course back when I worked as a seasonal ranger. People find it suspicious. I'm not saying it's suspicious. People find it suspicious that the FBI showed up on day 4. And it was explained to the wife something like, we think something is not right here, and we won't know that until we find him. I don't know what the hell that means, and I'm not aware of another search in which the FBI was involved. Now, the FBI has been involved in plane crashes, and they have been involved in environmental infractions. I'm not familiar with them playing a very active role in a search. The whole thing's just odd.
Yeah, very bizarre. And that quickly, too. Well, you said 4 days into the search is when they showed up?
They showed up on day 4.
Yeah, that is. I mean, at that point, it's still like this fresh search that we're doing right now. Yeah, very interesting. I don't even know what to make of it.
And this is not to downplay the importance of this man and the disappearance and the heartbreak of the family. This is an 82-year-old hunter who was not found hunting. This was not a public figure. There was nothing suspicious. Mm-hmm. It's just it's a very odd case that this person just vanished in the truest sense of the word.
Mm-hmm. Enough to gain the attention of the FBI of all people. So very, very bizarre. Yeah, and I've heard that story, and actually I've literally had people ask me to do a podcast episode on it. Felt like it wasn't really I don't know enough information about it, but also felt like probably not the best thing to go digging on. But yeah, man, what because that changes the element of the story, and my brain, my cryptozoology brain goes off the charts now with that. Who knows why? But again, whenever I see FBI show up in these stories, it's usually something much bigger and much more untold than we find ourselves experiencing. But really wild story.
And it would be interesting. I believe there is a book written about it already. I'm not sure. It would be a great book in the sense of a whodunit, but I don't really think anybody, or I shouldn't say whodunit. What the hell happened? It's quite interesting. Yeah. And now people have vanished. We've had quite a few people in the Adirondacks never be found, but the small area is what piques my interest in this case.
Sure. When I first heard that story, and I heard hunting, around a pond, my brain immediately went to, okay, well, like in the ADK, especially when we're hunting, we often hunt swamps because that's where deer hang out. And if you walk on swamps where you feel like, oh, that's land right there, and it turns out it's not, and you're going under, I feel like you could easily disappear and never be found again. But also, upon learning that this guy, exactly as you said, was a hunter safety instructor, it's like, okay, so he obviously knows what he's doing, where we are. He probably would know not to go on to those areas of ponds / swamps that look like land, but actually it's an island ready to kill you if you fall through it. Kind of like ice in the winter, but very interesting
Yes.
story.
Yes, it is very interesting. And if I may quickly here, I'm just looking at something. If you give me just a second, there was a quote from the wife, and if you'll bear with me just one moment, the quote is, I'm sorry about this. The wife said, I can't pull it up. I'm sorry. It's funny. It's on a newspaper website, and it's demanding that I subscribe so I can read the quote that I want to share with you. But basically it was, we think something's wrong and we can't tell you what it is, and we're not going to figure out till we find Thomas Messick, which is just an odd way of talking.
Yes, that's a very haunting thing to be told by the man at that point. Well, this book sounds like it's got lots of awesome stuff for anyone who is an Adirondack fanatic like myself. Definitely going to want to check that out. Well, the cover, who am I looking at here on the cover of this book?
Right. So some of my books have photography, my own photography, but then I've really become interested in a specific artist, and his name is Winslow Homer. Winslow Homer lived from 1836 to 1910. This is now the second book where I have a Winslow Homer painting. There's something about Homer's paintings, especially of the Adirondacks, but he also did quite a bit of work on the New England seaboard, that look very Adirondacky. I think he had a great connection to the land. He had some friends who had a cabin up around Newcomb, Johnsburg, somewhere up there, and he would go up and stay with them and then paint the Adirondacks. He has great scenes of guides. There are 2 guides on the cover of the book, river drives, fly fishing, cabins, etc. Most of his work is in the public domain, and it's absolutely stunning. So yeah, Winslow Homer, his work is very, very beautiful and worth finding and examining.
Yeah, absolutely. They got lots of his work too over at the ADKX Museum in Blue Mountain Lake, as well as just, probably hundreds of other artists' paintings and whatnot from all different times of history. Museum's awesome, but very good. All right. Well, are these books available right now for purchase?
They are.
All right,
yes.
Great. Where can people find this book, or both of them, and all of your books?
They can find all of them at my website. It's just my name, erikschlimmer.com, erikschlimmer.com. And then we also have some great bookstores in the Adirondacks that support independent authors. Okay, so you can get them online from me. They all come with 2 days of good luck, or you can go to, for example, Hals's Country Corner in Long Lake, the Bookstore Plus in Lake Placid, Hamlet's The Huts in Saranac Lake, the Crossroads in Chestertown, Otto's Abode in Wanakina, and a couple more. Those retailers are also listed on my website if you want to support a local business.
There we go. And any business in the ADK needs nonstop support. And also just pick up the book, because we all want Erik to keep writing these books about the ADK. So let me ask you this as we start to wrap things up here. You've been on the podcast so many times, I don't need to ask you the same 3 questions I always ask people at the end, but I am going to ask you one question. My final one of my main questions is, what makes the Adirondacks a unique place from your perspective? And I know you've answered it many times, but throughout the course of writing this book, you must have a new perspective now, again, on top of what you already knew, that has caused the Adirondacks to become even more unique to you. So what did you kind of learn throughout the process of this book that creates this place to be so much more unique than it was even before you started?
That's a very good question. There's a quote about the Adirondacks I remember, and it says, "The Adirondacks yielded grudgingly to civilization." So if you look at Mount Washington, New Hampshire, by the time Mount Marcy was climbed, the highest peak in the Adirondacks, there was already a road up Mount Washington and the highest peak in Vermont, Mount Mansfield. And then if you look at the settler history, I mean, New England is permeated with roads and sawmills and cabins and hamlets, etc. So there are these two special things about the Adirondacks, in that the peaks were the last ones to be climbed in the Northeast, and the range in general was the last to be settled. It was very difficult to penetrate the range all the way up into the 1800s. There were blank spots on a lot of maps of the Adirondacks in the 1800s, where most of New England had been mapped by that period. So it's a very stubborn, ornery range, and I think that's what makes it so special and beautiful.
I love it. Fantastic. All right, Erik, where can people find you online?
Yes, for a guy who likes to spend all his time in the mountains by himself, of course, there's a website, erikschlimmer.com. And then I'm also on Instagram. And the handle, I think they call it, is Schlimmer_goes, because that's what I do. I just kind of go places and do things.
I love it. Very good. All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of the 46 of 46 podcast. Remember to pick up Wicked Awesome Adirondack Chronology and the Cranberry Lake's 50 Place Names books at his website, erikschlimmer.com. The link will be in the show notes. He's got many more books all about the Adirondacks. Check it out at his website. But that's going to wrap up this episode of the podcast. Again, thank you, Erik, for coming back on the podcast. You are always welcome here. You are a fan favorite, and I'm always honored to have you on the show. Head over to 46outdoors.com and check out what I can offer you so that you can have a safe and successful Adirondack adventure up here in this beautiful park that most of us call home, whether you actually live here or you just recreate here. This is a home for most of you, and I love to hear that every time I do. But check it out, 46outdoors.com. Check back on Fridays for new mountains, new stories, new guests, and new episodes right here on the 46 of 46 podcast. You know the drill. Remember to always leave no trace, do the rock walk, and if you carry it in, carry it out. See you on the trails, everybody.